campaigns locally, regionally and internationally, and has championed children and young people's direct participation in decision making. Chris, really lovely to have you on this morning's programme. Thank you for joining us on Weekend World.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I've been listening in this morning, and it's a really interesting topic that you're discussing, so thank you for the invite.
So, Chris, tell us a little something about yourself, first of all, and how you came to be in this role and why you think it's so important to support the rights of children and young people.
Well, I guess the starting point is that I'm a father of 4 boys, and that's, I suppose, my first job in life is to be a parent to them and to guide them in their journey. But in terms of my own professional career, I left school in 1996, and I guess I was thinking about teaching at that time. But I ended up working in the community. I volunteered in a local community in North Belfast. And at that time, Belfast was pre-Good Friday Agreement, so there was violence on the streets, and a big part of my job was giving young people an alternative to getting involved in sectarian street violence. And I think it was then that my love and passion for social justice developed. It was working in a community, getting an understanding of how people can work together to try and make things better for everyone. So a particular community that I worked in would have suffered from socio-economic disadvantage, so lots of poverty, and that's then I followed a career in the youth work, and I've been a youth worker since leaving school, really, and I was honoured to get this job just over 18 months ago.
Incredible. And I mean, you've touched on something that is so important, because when we think about children's life chances and opportunities to be able to develop, and opportunities to get a good education and to be able to fulfill their own potential, poverty is something that has the potential to really hamper a child's rights in that respect. Even the simple aspects of good nutrition, being able to get enough food.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when you look at the poverty figures in UK, so here in Northern Ireland you have 1 in 4 children living in poverty. I think in England you're looking at maybe almost 1 in 3 children, and it's similar figures in Wales. And then in Scotland, it's about 1 in 5 children living in poverty. But you're absolutely right. Poverty is such a big issue, and has impacts on so many other areas of a child's life, education and health, to name just 2. So I believe that it's really it angers me. I think that's fair to say, that we have people living in poverty in 2025 in the UK. It just shouldn't happen. And I suppose that's when I was listening to the discussion this morning around the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and how amazing that document is. So that treaty, as your speakers had commented earlier, it's the most internationally ratified human rights treaty in the world. It's signed up by almost all of the countries in the UN, and that treaty is based on ensuring that children get what they need, ensuring that they get support, they live in safety, they have healthy, nutritious food and clean water. And these things aren't big asks; these are basic necessities. So I believe that treaty needs to be fully incorporated into domestic law. So they've done this in Scotland recently. There was a bill passed through the Scottish Parliament, and this would be that issue is, I suppose, my big priority during my term as Commissioner in Northern Ireland. It's probably the single most impactful thing that our policymakers can do, because it would ensure that all of those rights, the 42 articles, would be legally enforceable, and that we would have frameworks in place to ensure that the child's voice and the child's needs and their best interests are at the heart of every decision the government makes.
Really, really important.
Chris, I must say that the work that you have to do and the responsibility that you have within your portfolio is probably one of the most important portfolios maybe in government, because it really deals directly with our future generations and making sure that they have the tools to be able to flourish and to help our country flourish.
Yeah.
So against that assumption, let me ask you, where are you winning and where do you need to do more?
That is a really great question, and thank you for asking it. It does feel sometimes like every day is a battle, you know. Every day my office and I encounter really severe violations of children's rights, and those issues are quite broad, you know. I think one of the biggest issues that we grapple with is around education, and in particularly special educational needs. And this is a thing that's, I would suggest, a global issue, in that more children are presenting with more complex needs, and our education system doesn't always meet those needs. Big issues. Your caller previously mentioned mental health, and mental health. As long as I've been involved in youth work, mental health has been another key issue. You know, one of the issues that young people talk about the most. Unfortunately, I think that our systems aren't always built with young people in mind. I do think, particularly here in Northern Ireland, there's a lot of money wasted on pouring resources into systems that are broken. We don't pay enough time to prevention, and as you have said, giving children and young people the best start in life and the tools that they need in their journey. So in terms of where we're winning, I suppose on a more positive note, I did mention incorporation, and how Scotland has done a great job. I am privileged to be part of a network of ombudspersons and commissioners from across Britain and Ireland, as well as across Europe. And our collective voice and our collective power there is something that's quite special. I would hope that each of the regions or nations in the UK and Ireland can follow Scotland's lead and fully incorporate the convention into domestic law, and that's one place where we definitely are making progress. I think it should be acknowledged as well that we've come a long way. You know, it's a fantastic thing. When I'm talking to young people about the convention, I often start around the Second World War, where really terrible things happened. And on the back of that, a man from Poland called Janusz Korczak published some books, and it was his work that led to the convention being written and ratified. So that journey has been phenomenal. The fact that we have almost all of the nations in the UN having signed up to that convention is definitely a move forward. And I do feel very warmed that children now, lots of children have the language of rights. So they'll talk to me about their rights, they'll quote the convention, and that knowledge of rights is so important. Now, we do have lots of work to do. You know, I think the majority of children still wouldn't know about the convention, but we are making progress in those terms.
So I mean, I guess I'm really heartened by what you say, because, you know, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, you know, as I mentioned earlier on in this program, you know, we have youth organisations for both the girls and the boys that are designed to really help and develop them going forward. And we do a tremendous amount of work within the community, whether that's homeless feeding, you know, whether that's a disaster recovery, whether that's visiting the elderly, or providing support in schools. But I think that it's really important that young people have the opportunity to become more empowered and to participate in society. But what I don't see is the involvement of faith groups, whether that's Muslim groups or whether that's, you know, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, whether that's Christian groups or others, and the young people who really want to have a voice but don't have as much opportunity to have their voices heard, because policies from all of the political parties don't necessarily prioritise the interests of children because children don't vote. So how do we involve faith communities? How do we involve children? How do we give them a loud voice and a voice that is going to be heard by those in authority, so that the rights that you talk about can be implemented in practice? Yeah,
and again, this is really pertinent to my role right now. When I prioritise my work and how to, I suppose, educate people about their rights. The faith communities are so important in that. And here in Northern Ireland, those from a Muslim background would be probably a minority. Yeah, definitely a minority here, and their voices aren't often heard. And that's one community that I want to reach into. I want to reach into each of the faith communities, and my intention would be to liaise with the leaders of each of those communities over the next number of months. But I think the question about how we empower them children, one of the articles of the convention is Article 12, and that's the child's right to have a say in issues that affect their lives. And that right is so powerful. I suppose what we need to do as adults is listen to those voices and to take on board, take into account what children and young people are telling us, and act where appropriate, when it's in the best interests of the child. But back to the faith-based question, when I look at young people of different faiths and the powerful impact that they have within their communities, and as you've said, the kind of work that I would argue that, again, the convention, and I think one of your speakers spoke about this already, but the convention speaks directly to faith. It speaks directly to those general principles of how a child should be loved and treated and be safe, and the important role of parents. But I definitely do think we need to give more young people, particularly from a minority background, more opportunities to have that say, and to, I suppose, be like pebbles in the pond, and have that positive influence within their communities and across other communities as well.
Thank you, Chris. And I mean, you've spoken so powerfully about the importance of us supporting the rights of children in all of those respects. What do you think, thinking about your role, thinking about the work that has been done so far, what do you think are going to be your biggest challenges over the coming months? What would you really like to see affected in the greatest degree in respect of ensuring the rights of children are respected?
I think sometimes the news can be very depressing. We've got a really worrying geopolitical situation. We have war. We have really terrible things happening in Gaza, and the world sits and watches. I think we need to bring voice to those children who are suffering in war zones, those children who are voiceless, who don't have the basic necessities of a safe place to live, food and water. I think that I'm really fearful that some of the US policies on tariffs that we're seeing are going to affect our poorest people the worst. And they're big issues. They're things that I can't really influence directly, but I think collectively we need to use our voices. And then on a local level, I do think there are some simple steps we can take. I would argue that poverty is a political choice. I don't think that it's acceptable that people live here in poverty. This is one of the richest economies in the world, and we have children who are living in destitution. So, our politicians can absolutely act on that. In Northern Ireland, in 1998, there was an agreement signed here, the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, which brought peace and brought shared government. And in that agreement, government are legally mandated to publish an anti-poverty strategy, and we still don't have that, which is unacceptable. And that poverty strategy could include simple things around benefits, around free school meals, around uniforms, how we can put more money into people's pockets to avoid crisis. So I suppose, a priority for me, absolutely. Let's work on poverty. Let's try and ensure we have better health services for children, mental and physical health services, and big issues with regards to education, and in particular special educational needs. So yeah, there's a lot to do.
Yeah.
But we keep fighting, we keep battling, and that passion, that desire that fire in the belly that I talked about earlier, that I found as a young person growing up in North Belfast, still is there.
Yeah, fantastic.
Chris, I must ask you, because we've heard it twice in our news stories today. The BBC News is reporting that a Gaza hospital has been hit by an Israeli strike.
Yeah.
Apparently that has destroyed the intensive care unit, the surgery departments of the main medical facilities in Gaza City. Those are according to, the BBC says it's according to reports given to it by Hamas. How should we as a government, and how should we as a society, and how should we as an international community respond to what's happening to innocent people, but in particular to the voiceless children that you have mentioned? This is obviously a hugely emotive topic for lots of people, but what we're talking about here are children who have no voice and have no ability to participate or contribute to any kind of outcome. So focusing on the children, focusing on the victims.
Yeah.
How should we, as an international community and as a government, address this crisis?
I think the first thing that we all need to do is call this out. It needs to be condemned. I did hear it on the news this morning, and it is really it's hard to find words, actually. And I do really worry about maybe a societal shrug or apathy. Our political leaders need to be heard on these issues. We need to remember, from a child's rights perspective, those children are rights holders. Their suffering should not be unrecognised. This is absolutely a tragedy, and I would say a global failure to uphold children's rights and to protect children. There are various articles. If I go back to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, there are various articles there. Article 6 talks about the right of life, survival and development. Article 38 specifically talks about the right to be protected from armed conflict and the effects of war. And then there are other articles there around education, around health, around the right to shelter and life. But I do think we need to speak. We need to give voice to these people who are living in such horrendous conditions. And in the past 2 weeks, I spoke with he was a correspondent. This gentleman used to be a BBC News correspondent, and he was telling me what he saw in Gaza many years ago was really, really awful. But now, in his eyes, things are a lot worse. So, this isn't a new. Unfortunately, this is not a new issue. In my opinion, this has been going on for a long, long time, and people have fled war. People are getting driven out of their homes, and the fact that we're hearing about hospitals being bombed is really it's a huge tragedy. And I do, I feel a sense of shame as well that we're not our the international community needs to speak louder on these issues. It's really it's absolutely horrible, and I say it is hard to find words. It's hard not to get emotional when you think about what's happening there, but I do think we're talking about a global failure to uphold the rights of children when we think about Gaza and other wars across the globe.
And I guess that's the really important part of this. The devastation that's being wrought in Gaza is the biggest example of violence against children, especially around the world, but it's not the only one. And we see this played out in so many different parts of the world, and the moral failure of the international community is something that needs to be called out. Yeah,
absolutely. And I spoke earlier there about Janusz Korczak, the Polish broadcaster and writer, who during the Holocaust he refused to leave children. He refused to leave children just to be marched to their death. And at that time, the world sat up and said this should not happen again. These tragedies should not happen again. And the United Nations was set up, the UN Declaration was written, but we are seeing these horrible things continuing. And you look at Syria, Yemen, Gaza, Sudan, Ukraine, Democratic Republic of Congo. Like there's so many of these wars that are going on, and children, like people generally, populations are suffering hugely. But I would say, from a children's perspective, it's often children that feel the brunt of this. So it's a tragedy, and I suppose I'm making a plea, as we all are, for all of our leaders to speak up. This just simply shouldn't be happening.
Chris, I would just say it's more a comment than a question, but there is great courage and nobility in standing up for what you believe and in conviction. And I can certainly say that I very much hope and pray that all of your noble intentions and all of the efforts that you're making in order to find justice for children find traction, and that you have great success in the work that you're doing. You've only been in post for 18 months, but we very much hope that you're able to achieve what you want to achieve and help those vulnerable individuals who don't have a voice. They certainly seem to have something of a voice in you, Chris. Thank you.